So Nick, Knight, we're here to talk a little bit about Isabella Blow, and I want to start just by asking you a little bit about the catalogue that you shot, the Rizzoli books, to go alongside the exhibition, just because it's so beautiful. Tell me a little bit about working on that shoot, because it really does reflect Isabella's character and spirit.
Yes. Well, the shoot, the problem was to try and do something with that collection, how to best express it. And of course, one wanted to see Izzy in it and not anybody else. And it was, you were not going to have that, so what do we do? And do we have people with sort of like in the way that Jean-Paul Goude did with Grace Jones? Do you have everybody with Isabella's face sort of as a mask? That didn't seem right. And then we were thinking of shooting it in the studio and making it very bad, but it didn't seem right. Anyway, so then the idea of shooting at Doddington came up, which of course was brilliant. And so we all went up to Doddington, we were there for 4 or 5 days. And it was just seen to be appropriate, because this is a place, I mean, she never lived in Doddington Hall, she lived on one of the houses, smaller houses on the grounds, but it was always her dream to live there. And it was belonged to her grandfather. And it was just seen to be the correct context for those clothes. And as we'll probably talk about later, so I know we're going to talk about psychiatry and we're going to talk about mental illness, context is everything. And so I think this was the right context to see those clothes. And it allows those clothes to live within a world which is fantasy, which is a lot about what those clothes were about. The girls that we got to model, and we ranged, we for a long time we thought, well, who should we use? Should we use the girls that she actually sort of championed at the time, so people like Anna Fraser or Sophie Dahl. And then we thought, well, no, if Isabella was casting it now, who would she cast? And of course, you know, there are also, I have favourite models and people I really like and want to work with and excited to work with and knew would understand the project. And we wanted a range of people, and also Isabella's shape was important. The perception of her as a long, tall, thin thing, of course, is not true to actually physically how she was. She was, I won't say she's short, but she wasn't a tall woman, and she had a very big bust.
Which she enjoyed accentuating.
Which she actually liked showing. And so you had to find people, and a lot of very tall models, very flat-chested. So it was a kind of, you know, the casting thing was, you know, we tried to take on slightly her persona and slightly the sort of girl she would have liked and probably sort of been happy to represent her. And I think the girls that modelled the clothes were brilliant. I mean, in a way, they're your principal actresses or actors, if you want, within the film or the piece you're creating. So it's their role to interpret a narrative. So it's Liberty or Alexia or whoever it was that was wearing the clothes. You know, they were interpreting Isabella Blow. The weird thing is it became very uncanny that in this environment, wearing those clothes, and somebody, for instance, like Alexia White, who is sort of tall and thin, looked just like her. And there were moments where you had to kind of pinch yourself, thinking, actually, that's not Izzy sitting next to me in those antlers, it's model. And I think because Isabella's clothes were also not disguised, because they weren't, they were sort of more armour, but they were certainly, they disguised her as a person to a certain degree. You know, she didn't wear lots of stuff that was body conscious, you know, there were lots of accessories and lots of layers and lots of hats, obviously. And she mentioned that they were a bit like armour for her. My point is that you could put different people in and you wouldn't really see that person, you see the clothes being worn. And so that was where it came about. And it was one of those moments or those projects which are unique. You know, to have that set of clothes, to be in that environment with those people, to be working with Daphne Guinness and Amanda Harlick, and Topolino, and all the sort of the crew we had around us was such a kind of lovely and rare moment. And also the people from Somerset House, Shona and Alexander, were so pushing us to be inventive with the imagery and expressive with the imagery. There was no sort of, we can't see the fact that that dress did that, or I was allowed to be very expressive with my imagery, which is great, and they were very keen on that. I was worried that might be a thing, saying, it's an exhibition catalogue, therefore you've got to understand the shoulder straps here, and this is, but not at all. Which I think is in the spirit which Isabella would have worn the clothes. So I think it was a very rare and it was very, very lovely 4 days, actually. Because you wake up in this, you woke up at a hotel nearby, but by sort of 8:30 in the morning, you're in this splendid place, which is all falling down, this great old stately home, and half of the wing, half of it is this huge servants' quarters, so servants' wing, if you want, which is all completely dilapidated. So the roof's fallen through, and the walls are all crumbling, and so it's actually we weren't supposed to be in it insurance-wise, but we still were. and the main house is more or less sort of physically intact. So you have a beautiful old ballroom. It's just deserted, but it's got all the grandeur of a ballroom, and was designed to encourage people, to want to dance or to want to sort of live that space. So space is incredibly important, and it's very uplifting and very inspiring. And of course you've got all the sort of all the memories of that place. All that you feel something in the air. So they used to throw great sort of parties there every weekend, and this is a bit of that. The weird thing, which is not a weird thing, but the sort of counterpoint to that is it was a girls' school in the sort of 60s, 70s and 80s, I think. And so lots of the traces of that are still there. And
you've put some of those in the catalogue. You can see sort of wanker sort of written on the
walls.
Yes,
we put wanker in the catalogue.
But that's quite Izzy, that humour and that sort
Yes, absolutely, and her sort of rather brash sort of way of speaking and slightly inappropriate way of speaking, where she speak about very sexual things which people really wouldn't normally say. She would speak about very openly. So I think there's some degree of that. But where I was picking up on it is partly had the memories of these parties, and partly when people send their children to boarding school, I mean less now, but certainly back in my day, which is in the 1970s when I would have gone to school, the idea that you were sent away from your family is always a harsh thing, and one imagines these poor children sent away from their families and deeply miserable in this bloody old house. There's lots of graffiti to testimony to that. Mrs. So-and-so, that hated one of the teachers, and her name, unfortunately, poor woman, would come up a lot in the graffiti. There's lots of graffiti behind the shutters and inside the cupboards and that sort of thing. So-and-so's a letter, kick her in the gob, and all this sort of stuff. So there's lots of that, and lots of sort of very painful children separated from their family. And seeking out the love of their family and feeling rejected, because you send your child off to a school, and lots of people do it, and I don't criticise it. My children have gone to Bedales, two or three have, under their own desire to, not my desire. There's that sort of thing of children separated and the love of a child wants in its life, which characteristically marks it for the rest of its life, was very, very prevalent in the writing there, and you could feel that. And Izzy certainly had that without wanting to delve into the family sort of history and there's things which are too personal to want to just air, but there's a certain amount of love that Isabella, I think, wanted from her family that she didn't feel she got, and particularly her father. And I think that was interesting because it felt that love or need of a child to be loved and to be the most important thing in their parents' eyes. Very clear in the graffiti scrawled and carved into the wood. So that felt correct. So there's different things there. It was very inspiring.
Well, it's interesting because you hinted at it very much so there. Because the reason I wanted to start by talking about the catalogue is I think one thing that I found particularly striking about it was that divide between the vibrancy and the optimism of how Izzy dressed and that kind of the happy side, to put it simplistically. Then also there was that undertone of sadness and of perhaps elements of distress, and I think
the other way around actually. There's an undertone of happiness and a larger kind of distress.
But I think you get a sense of that, the excitement and the beauty and the vibrancy that she brought to fashion. And I think that was really lovely. But I want to talk, without being too dark, I want to talk about that.
Must be dark.
That slightly sad side of Izzy's life, because that was a huge part of who she was, and maybe I think a part of her creativity, and that's something I wanted to ask you about, because creativity can be a difficult thing, can't it?
Hard one to answer in a yes or no way. Creativity, and I know that the sort of topic of our conversation is the link between creativity and insanity, which is an interesting topic in so many different ways. I'm trying to be succinct with my answer to you. I think one of the important things to get across is the creative world, if you want to call it the art world, the fashion world, it depends how you define it, but we sort of know what I mean, is very accepting of behaviour that outside of that world would be seen as not just eccentric and mildly eccentric, but all reasons to be medicated or reasons to be sanctioned. So I was just thinking, my father was my father was a psychologist, and I started off my career believing that I wanted to get into medicine and then to specialise in psychiatry. So I come a little bit from that orientation. The world my father worked in, he was a psychologist for the Ministry of Defence. And so he ended his career in Admiralty Arch. And I remember going to his offices there, and they were incredibly drab inside and incredibly sort of grey. And have you ever seen Tinker Tailor? That's the world. But behaviour within those things, if my father had arrived at work flamboyantly dressed, people would automatically presume something was going wrong. If I arrived this morning wearing a wedding dress, or a suit of armour, you'd have looked a bit surprised, but you've accepted within the parameters of what we do, it's sort of acceptable behaviour. And Isabella Blow would turn up to work with antlers on her head or in a full suit of armour or whatever it is. And so this way of being eccentric is very much tolerated within the artistic community. And in fact, it's not just tolerated, it's rewarded. The more we hear about, the strange behaviour of Alexander McQueen or Isabella Blow or Jackson Pollock or whoever it is, there's a certain amount of, we like that. But actually outside of this world, it's not correct. It is not accepted, and it's very difficult. So that leads you to start to wonder, well, are the people who are creative in a way, are they exhibiting forms of mental illness? Or is it just the fact that they're drawn towards the creative world because then they don't feel confined by their mental state and they're allowed to indulge themselves? So there's a kind of interesting, an interesting sort of context for this, and trying to see, where one set of behaviour is totally inappropriate and certifiable, another set of behaviour it's rewarded. And we all say, oh, fantastic, look at that Jackson Pollock, it was great. Well, he was, as far as I know, a gun-toting, alcoholic, wife-beating. I mean, please, I'm not going to slander him if he wasn't. But I think that's the kind of, and people who had very, very strong and very, ways of behaving, which were not acceptable, find their niche within the creative world. Sort of flip side of that, in a more positive way, but that seems negative, is somebody like Isabella Blow will push even those boundaries, and within those boundaries, also by pushing those boundaries, makes everybody else feel they can go further. So you want the sort of avant-garde, if you want, that they're pushing these things. So her behaviour and the way she would dress allows other people to take that further and to enjoy the experience of doing that. Society can feel incredibly tight for some people and incredibly restrictive, and therefore you get people who kick against that. I quite naturally, weirdly, kick against any authority, which would be surprising because I look like I'm the sort of person who goes absolutely on. But it's again kicking against a different sort of set of rules. But something like Isabella Blow, through her acts and through her encouragement of other people, etc., actually gets those posts which defines, those boundaries which define our behaviour, and pushes them way out there. Which of course, we then all don't start turning up to work with antlers on our head, or turning up to see our friends completely dressed in armour, or we do not talk openly about our emotions like she did, sexual and her suicidal emotions and everything else that she talked about so freely. But it does allow you to take that a bit more that way. I mean, there's that famous psychology test where they say to somebody, how old was Gandhi? And they say, I don't know. So you say, oh, actually he died how old was Gandhi when he died? Oh, he died, he was 150. You go, oh, he wasn't really going to know, okay. But they say, so how old was he? And then people will say, well, perhaps he was 70 or 80. He was younger when he died. So it's that sort of thing that if you set the parameters further, people will move towards that parameter. Yeah. So not a very good...
No, that is
a very account of
that
that psychological trick, but it's the sort of thing that you do. So that somebody like Isabella actually is very, very important within the creative world, because otherwise we all get slightly more and more restrained. And the thing of being able to define somebody's mental state is a difficult thing, because it's been used a lot against people. And you can think about, especially in Victorian times, where people were quite often sanctioned and sent away, etc., for exhibiting what now we will recognise quite easily as treatable and acceptable forms of behaviour. So it's a sort of, psychiatry and mental illness is a very difficult subject. I think Isabella's fact that she took her own life, but she was very open about taking her own life, that makes it a lot more poignant. But I asked one of our interns, our young Sarah, to look at instances of people taking their own lives, or how much was prevalent within the creative industries, to see whether actually there were lots of examples of this. I mean, very famously, and again, I tread lightly because these are people's lives. I tread delicately, should I say. But Guy Bourdin had 2 girlfriends and a wife that committed suicide. He probably scores very high in that, but there are lots of other instances of people within the creative world and the fashion world, especially. Lee McQueen, tragically, is another one, who did take their own lives. But I don't know whether that's, as I say, because the creative world is accepting of those sort of people and indeed encouraging of those sort of people, or whether it's because the creative world has such a pressure on you to perform, to look, to see things that other people can't see, that you expose yourself. Diane Arbus is a good example of perhaps that theory. Diane Arbus killed herself at 48 or something, which is, did she see too much? Could she not deal with what she saw in humanity? I'm allowed as a photographer or an image maker, to study you. So I'm able to look at you and try and understand you, and I can walk out into the street and I can approach anybody I choose to and say, excuse me, can I take your photograph? And that allows me people. So it allows me an entrance into people's lives, and I think it's what Diana Arbus had. She could walk up to anybody she fancied anybody she wanted to in the street, and just ask them whether or not she could become part of their lives and take their photograph. So that gives her access to something. So there's a sort of, there's a question that gets raised as to whether the burden of being creative, well, not the burden, but the sort of, if you want, the sort of license of being creative is destructive in the end, because it allows you to push and push and push and push and push. When I go into a shoot to make a film or to create images or whatever it is, I know for a fact that I become super sensitive to life. Super sensitive to life is what I was trying to say. That I'm hyper aware. I purposely indulge that state. So I will, and over the years I realised, okay, so that means I don't drink beforehand. I try and go to bed 2 or 3 nights early, to make sure that I'm as physically able, as like a sports person would.
Yeah, exactly. You
get yourself in some sort of mental training. It's very hard in the creative arts to think, how do you get better? If I was a sports person, if I was a runner, I think, okay, well, I train harder, I wear, certain things, certain sorts of shoes, push. But to train your brain to be more what? As a photographer or an image maker, how do I become better? Not because I think I'm that great, quite the opposite, but how do I get my imagery better? So what do I have to do? And there's nobody can tell you that. Yeah. There is no teacher who is sitting next to me saying, well, actually, you need to look at this composition, or you need to look at how you behave with these people. Or, so you're doing it by trial and error. But you're doing, there's a lot of pressure to you when you go into a shoot, on you when you go into a shoot, but you are making yourself super sensitive to every little thing which normally we'd kind of miss. So you work in this highly sensitized state. Now that's great, because I can sit in front of you and I can look at you, and in my mind you can become, a musical score. I can notice every little tiny detail about you and things that enchant me, and etc. And I'll embed, which of course I can't normally do. And so if I sat in front of you and studied you in the way that I would do if I was taking a photograph, that you'd find that behaviour totally unacceptable. I'm allowed to do that, and I'm encouraged to do that. I'm pushed to try and see things that I can't see, that aren't there. Try and imagine things around you. So that sort of degree of, if you want, psycho...
I guess it's about letting your mind go in a way as well, isn't it?
It's about pushing your mind to go, pushing things that you wouldn't normally be able to do. So there's a sort of, there's a degree of becoming aware of life in a way that you wouldn't be able to deal with if you did it any other time. The pressure that people then under commercially, whether it's somebody who's got to sell their photographs or their paintings in a gallery, and there's huge prices on something like a Richard Prince or whoever we care to mention, but some of these, that's a pressure, and that's a distorting thing. So money becomes a distorting thing in both ways, both in terms of the when you do get paid a lot of money to do something, that's a distorting value, that distorts your self-worth, and also when you don't. So Isabella's problem was the fact that she never got any money from anybody, and that's a distorting thing. Whereas clearly her influence on other people, whether it's Julia MacDonald or Sean Ellis or Alexander McQueen or Philip Tracy, was huge in financial terms. So the money becomes a distorting thing, but the pressure to re-perform and perform again and then perform again and keep on performing and keep on pulling out of thin air these things that nobody else can see and everybody's going to applaud or tag is a huge pressure. So when I stand in front of somebody and I have to create an image of them, I can never practice that. I can never sort of, I can't get, whoever it is, Isabella Blow or not Isabella, but I can't do that portrait beforehand. It's on that moment. So everything is based on that particular moment. Unlike a songwriter or an actor or anything else, I can't rehearse. All I can do is react. And tuning my emotions and tuning my perception, my intuition, is something I don't know how to do. So I'm doing it by trial and error. And often people make quite odd ways of behaving. Just think, right, well, last time it worked for me because I had that music on, and I was using this lighting, and people were saying this to me, and that's what works for me, and I want the ground scattered with Smarties, and I want raindrops as I walk in, or whatever it is. They get this whole sort of folly around, which is actually just symptomatic of total fear. And the more you see that in these kind of slightly exigent, is that the right word? When people want stuff that's out of the ordinary. The more you see that behavior, that's fear you're seeing, because they're terrified of failing. And so there is a huge pressure that goes on people, a huge pressure on very sensitive people. And that is often, I would say, why you have such, or partly why you have such a degree of sort of, mental instability and mental kind of failure and breakdown leading to suicide within the arts, because they are under huge pressure. The flip side to that is to say, you justify your behaviour by calling yourself an artist, and that's a bit it's that sort of, you think you can be that way because you're an artist. Actually, just grow up and kind of get in the real world, and there's that sort of thing. Because people who are not in the art world, people who work in banks or in grocers or on buses or wherever it is, also have mental illness and also have mental breakdowns and also can't cope with life and also feel that. So it's a tricky one, and I feel slightly I blunder into a very sensitive subject, not having all the information I'd like to, but being aware of some of the issues that somebody like Isabella Blow or Alexander McQueen might indeed faced, and therefore chosen to do what they did.
I'm really interested in what you just said, because it seems like there's two things at play. On one hand, there's this kind of personal pressure that one, whether willingly or not, puts on themselves to perform and to produce something that they deem creative and beautiful. And on the other hand, there's this kind of surrounding pressure that comes from people, like the expectation that you addressed. And I find what you said about training incredibly interesting, because I guess going back to that personal pressure, it's as you said, with an athlete, they know what they need to do to get better. With you, are you even aware where your creativity comes from? I guess talent is very sort of fluid when it comes to creativity, and it's very hard to pin down, whereas with a sportsman it's much easier to sort of understand why they can do what they can do. But with a creative, I guess, do you know why you can do what you can do? So it's a very tough question.
Yes, only tough because it needs several answers to it. I know that for me it's desire that fuels me. It's total desire. So I desire to see that image created. I desire to see that. It's a sort of, you follow your desires. So in that way I know where it comes from. And it's an addiction. There's a certain, without sounding too whatever, but I'll say it all the same, you get to a different mental state. With the pressure that's on you, with the whole pressure of A, performance, B, responsibility, and C, just desire to see something, it's all pressure. It's like putting a lot of energy on somebody. And when you get to the point where you are creating images in a shoot context, I've said this before, but when you first start, everything's awful. I mean, you do the first picture and it doesn't look any good, and you can't, and it's like trying to run through treacle. Every movement is difficult physically, you're ill at ease. It's all, and you have to push that down, and you have to not get annoyed that the lighting's not right, and you have to not get annoyed that the art director's listening. Every possible problem is there straight away. The person that everybody else has made look beautiful effortlessly now looks like, doesn't look great in your photographs. So it's that sort of thing. So that's an enormous pressure. But when you get to the point where you are creating imagery and the imagery comes, then it feels so wonderful. Then you feel not all powerful, but you feel totally serene, as if creating great imagery is easy. But it's just a question of plucking it off the branch of a tree.
And is that feeling addictive?
Very. So I know A, that I'm fueled by desire. B, I'm fueled by this feeling that I want to get to that state again. I want to get to that state where you feel so good. So there's an addiction and a sort of, if you want to sort of, as I said, I'm allowed to indulge every desire I want. As an artist, I'm allowed to do whatever I want virtually. There's nowhere else in society you can have that. Any other walk of life, and I'd be screwed without wanting to put a too fine a term. But if I was working for the Ministry of Defence like my dad, or I was a doctor, or I'd been struck off years ago. But in the arts, you're allowed to be whatever you want to be. Is
that freedom dangerous, do you think, or is it wonderful?
Dangerous for the individual, dangerous for the rest of the world.
Maybe for the individual in the context of this conversation.
I don't know if it's dangerous. It's difficult, that's for sure. It depends, Lou. We have we have a few very pronounced, and certainly pronounced for me, instances where the creative world, the pressures of the creative world have been difficult for the individual. I'm talking about John Galliano, Lee McQueen, Isabella Blow. All three of those people I knew to a certain degree, and had a lot of love for all three of them actually. And they've all exhibited different ways. Sadly and tragically, Lee and Isabella took their lives. John, had a lot of trouble in different ways. And as I say, I step very delicately here, tread very delicately here. So I think in that way, yes, one could look at those examples and say, yes, it's dangerous. But it allowed those people to create such visions that will endure forever now. The clothes of John Galliano or the clothes of Alexander McQueen. I like the great paintings of Da Vinci or whoever. These are incredible pieces of art, and the whole vision is an incredible piece of art, and that will live on forever. Now we have to justify where we get our feeling that we belong in this world and our purpose here. And it is something that people come to at a certain point in their life to go, what's all this about? Why am I on this planet? What am I doing? What's the purpose? What should I be doing? And there's that sort of, it's a question that happens to most people at some point in their lives, is they question their existence. And if you want some justification of your existence, and therefore then some reward for your existence, is this idea that you can create something which will live forever even if you don't. And perhaps people like Lee McQueen with Isabella Blow thought they'd done it, thought they had created the thing they wanted to create. So not necessarily seen as dangerous, but seen as allowing them to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. I don't know, and it's so personal and so particular to each person. I'd hate to say it was a dangerous thing, the freedom of creativity or the pressures of creativity.
I guess this is a very controversial question, but it's one I want to ask nonetheless. You talk about the incredible output of someone like John Galliano or Isabella Blow with her styling, or Alexander McQueen with his collections, and I question whether they would have got to that place of sheer sort of creative brilliance without some elements of that mental darkness that they experienced. And I guess what I'm asking, and it sounds very controversial, is it worth it?
Yes. I don't know the mental darkness thing. I'm just having a little bit of an issue with that. I mean, Alexander McQueen's interest in things which were dark is quite well documented. Isabella's interest in history and the past. I mean, it also deals with death. But I mean, there's so many, in rock and roll, I mean, death is dealt with. If you think of rock and roll, how quickly does the image of a skull come to your mind?
Yeah.
So the idea that we make life feel more precious by skirting the edges of it and starting to deal with death is something which is so prevalent throughout the arts, from Edvard Munch to kind of, to all the way through rock and roll to, Kurt Cobain, to anybody you want to kind of mention. There is this, you make yourself feel more alive if you're treading the edge of a precipice, because then you hold on to life more dearly, and then life feels more exciting. So you purposely push yourself. And there's so much sort of examples of that in the arts. What was your question?
I'm asking I guess what I'm trying to get at, and I think it's so fascinating what you say, is that pushing, and is that sort of getting to a point where maybe you are in a slight sense of sort of mental distress or turmoil, is it worth it for that creative output? Is it a sacrifice that's...
Well, what else do you want? What do you want out of life? Do you is it wealth, or is it riches or respect, or what are the goals of one? And very quickly you work out that it really is not wealth, it really is not fame. These are false goals. I mean, really false goals. The worrying thing in how we are presented life at the moment is we are encouraged to want false goals. And so the goal of fame or fortune, which are the most popular and mentioned goals in life, are worthless. And not worthless, they're insidiously dangerous to go after those. So it depends what you say. If it's worth it, it depends what you want out of life. Do you want your life to be thrilling? Do you want your life to be the feeling that you see things that you couldn't possibly have seen, that you've got to places in your mind or your output creatively which you find thrilling? It depends what you want. And Isabella's probably just wanted the love of her father. So if she got some of the feeling that she didn't get from him, then yes, that was probably worth it for her. I feel a lot of the creative industry is fueled by children who are still asking for their parents' love. And it's tricky to mention anybody's names, but you can see that in the more flamboyant behaviour of some of the people we see in the creative world, who are saying, "I'm here, look at me," and you feel, who are they saying that for? Because as I know some of these people, you think, well, actually, they're not really physically in contact with the people who are adoring them. It's their parents that they want the love from. And if they had the love of their parents, would they then not produce this body of work? As a father, it's quite hard then to sort of, what do you apply to your children, other than the kind of, I shouldn't really be talking about my children in public kind of way, but how do you bring up a child? Do you bring up a child to fit into society and therefore not excel? Do you bring up a child to quest something because you would draw it for them? I really am saying, I just totally love my children, and there's no, my father,
creative experiment going on.
Like my father had no psychology experiments with us, thank goodness. You ever heard about the work of Skinner?
No.
Oh, dreadful. Anyway, whatever. We digress. And Anyway, so what?
And your children are very happy as well.
Well, sure, like everybody else have their moments of being.
But I guess you're getting to what I guess I find just interesting is this idea of, is the unhappiness and is the lack of parental love, or however you put it, is it worth it for that creative output? Do we need that? Do we need the Isabella Blows and the Lee McQueens as much as
we definitely need them because they make society bigger.
But how do you help someone then? Because as you hinted, you don't want to get rid of that state. You don't want to get rid of those people that as you say, sort of skirt to the edges and see everything, feel more than others, because that's where you get the greatest creative output. Yeah. So is it wrong that we put a focus on making people better? Or
do you mean curing mental illness?
Exactly, yeah.
I don't know we cure mental illness, don't we just treat the symptoms? So this is a conversation I was having just before we went live, that you don't actually, the sway now is towards dealing with the symptoms, not dealing with the causes, which is probably wrong. The slightly nasty, insidious hand that I start to feel within the treatment of mental illness is that of the pharmaceutical companies. How much profit are they making from that? And for some reason, to me, all evil seems to be more increasingly coming from money. But there's a nasty feeling that actually pharmaceutical companies are perhaps encouraging diagnosis and therefore encouraging the treatment of the symptoms, not of the cure, and not of the cause, for their own profit making. And that's not very nice feeling. But then again, that comes down to capitalism and all those sorts of things, which is a slightly different discussion.
So what's the future for something like this? How do we take it forward? Because one of the amazing things about the Isabella Blow Foundation is working with young people to ensure, that they're protected and they're looked after and they're cared for, young creative minds.
I have a slight problem with this because it feels a bit sort of do-goody and a bit. I mean, I have to be very, very careful because it's a very difficult subject for a lot of people. But I don't like. I mean, are you saying therefore that we will no longer have an Isabella Blows?
Exactly.
That we'll no longer have an because we actually made them all happy and normal and don't want to do this. So it's a whole dilemma. Do we love the torment of our artists? And do we encourage our artists to be tormented because we can't be? So we push it all into them, allow them to become these sort of the people that burn up in our, the whole sort of Marilyn Monroe, Kurt Cobain, all those instances of kind of incredibly adored people because they died young, because they burnt up by their own creativity or burnt up because of their own access. So do we live with that because that's what, as a society, we can't do, so therefore we encourage that? So therefore, do we want to medicate them and get rid of that?
Yeah.
I don't know if you do. I think you just have to let people be people and find their own ways. I don't think having a drugged up version of it, somebody on one of those sort of Valiums, I don't think that's a society that I would like to propose. But one doesn't want to propose a society where there's pain, difficultness, and heartbreak, and all the things that do create a sort of desire to keep on proving we're here. So it's a tricky conundrum, and I don't profess to have the answer to it. But I do realise it's a problem. Isabella Blow, I've said about 3 times in an interview, but I'm so aware of this. It's a real person who had a real family, who have feelings, still have feelings. But she was very open about her suicide. She would set her assistants tasked to go and research ways of killing herself. I met her in a club. The first thing she said to me was, I'm finishing it this weekend. I'm killing myself this weekend. And it was said in such a matter-of-fact way that it didn't register with me. I was sort of said, really? It was like, how do I deal with that comment? And I went back home. I was quite troubled by it because it's one of those things I think, did I just hear that right? So I wrote her a letter. Saying, Izzy, you should just know that actually, whatever your reasons you are sad, people love you, and I love you, and we care for you, and we think you're brilliant, and I'm not sure whether this helps, but I just wanted to say it in case nobody's saying it to you. And apparently I drove the letter around to Eaton Square and posted it through a letterbox at 2 a.m. And apparently when she received the letter, she was very happy. But then after she said, yeah, still bastard still hasn't employed me, which is kind of, it's like tricky. Yeah, some people are hard to help, and it is tricky. I mean, there was that feeling with her that she felt very much that, she wasn't supported by the people she supported, which isn't completely true, and obviously there's always different variations of that. But I think there was a hurt within her. Whether that was the primary reason she took her own life, or whether she just thought she was done. There's a certain point you do get to in life where you think, well, what else am I going to keep on adding to this world? Maybe she thought she was done. She'd done her thing. I don't really know. I don't know the real reasons that she took her life, but she didn't do it in a private way. She didn't go somewhere quiet and dark where nobody would ever find out and commit suicide. She did it in a flamboyant and a very open, disarmingly open way, which does in one way bring the subject of suicide out into the open, so it doesn't become sort of people's awful secret. In a way that religion makes us feel that suicide is something dreadful, because you don't get to nirvana if you commit suicide. It's like a weird pun. But you don't get to the sort of higher place if you commit suicide, and that's a sort of religious thing. But I have such a suspicion of organised religion in any case. So there is a sort of stigma attached to suicide, but it's just a sort of tricky thing. I mean, people have to make their own decisions in the end. Her taking her life in the way she did brought suicide very much into the open. Again, the problem is you have copycat suicides, so people then romantically get a sort of desire for it, becomes a sort of a romantic...
They fetishise it, don't they?
They fetishise it, and it becomes a sort of romantic notion. Like the starving artist in the garret, it becomes a sort of, if you're a real artist, it becomes too much you, therefore you kill yourself. There are lots of times in life where we think, I'm fed up with this, I'm off. But actually we all kind of rationalise it out and go on, blah, blah. Not all, most of us rationalise it out and go on and keep on going. And I think there's a danger in that it becomes a romantic notion of suicide. But everybody has their own set of reasons to do what they do. Isabella didn't do it in a sort of quiet way. She did it in a very open way, like she did everything. One of the incidents I remember most distinctly about Izzy was I got a phone call from her one morning at 9 o'clock in the morning or 8:30, and out of the blue, she said, "Nick, I've got to read you this poem. I made love to the most beautiful man last night. It was fantastic." And then proceeded to tell me a lot about the very graphic nature of her lovemaking. I said, "But I've got to read you this poem." And she read me the Andre Breton poem, which name I forget now, but I can recall. So to have her recounting to me in totally open, totally frank way her sexual exploits of the evening before, and then reading this love poem about my wife whose eyes like this and tears of that, and the surrealist poem, beautiful surrealist poem, which actually then got Brad Pitt to read weirdly. But that was a sort of totally against all the ways we're supposed to speak to each other, or we're allowed or encouraged to speak to each other. We're not supposed to be that frank. We're not supposed to talk about sex in the way that she's supposed to talk. There's still a sort of feeling that it's not appropriate to do that. And Isabella Blow was not appropriate in those ways. And she talked about her suicide in the same way, in this very open, candid, above board sort of way. So there's a romantic notion that she suffered awfully, and it was an awful thing to have happened to her. For us left on this planet, it's an awful thing, because then you lose the people that you care about. But for her, maybe it wasn't. Maybe for her it was a sort of, that she had done her thing. She had to go. Anyway, we're all just guessing.
Thank you, Nick.
My pleasure.